Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Hallie Franks, and I am an associate professor of ancient studies at the Gallatin School at New York University. And it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker in our Emerging Scholars presentation series. This series is organized and hosted by NYU's Center for Ancient Studies, and I'd like to thank Matthew Santarocco and Mara Pollard for their support of this series. The Emerging Scholars series showcases the research of current PhD candidates, and we are particularly excited to engage approaches to the study of the ancient world that incorporate non-traditional materials and/or methods. Today, we will hear from and I will speak with Natalie Swain. Natalie is a PhD student at the University of Bristol, UK, with a particular interest in Latin elegy, narratology, and classical reception in modern comics and video games. Her doctoral dissertation focuses on the possible application of comics narratology to Ovid's Amores, which she will be submitting this fall. She's currently the chair of the membership committee of Antiquity and Media Studies and actively participates in public outreach, including the hashtag Classics Twitter Comics Book Club on Twitter, which you are all invited to join. When not working on her dissertation, she is wrestling with her cats, which I am too, or working as a guide in the high Arctic, which I do not venture. Take it away. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Haley, and NYU for organizing this. All right. So when I talk about my research, one of the first questions I like to ask, especially when talking with classicists, is the really simple question, what is a comic? Most of us do sort of have a sense of what a comic looks like. This is usually what we think of. 3 or more panels that incorporate visual and text, often text, not always, of course, appearing in a sequence that, of course, it tells some kind of narrative. Fortunately for all of us, I don't have to define it because many comic scholars have done this for us. And a definition that I really like was given by Scott McCloud, whose Understanding Comics I do highly recommend to everybody. And he wrote way back in the 90s that comics could be defined as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. And I think that's a really good description. Of course, there's no superheroes in that definition, as there shouldn't be. And it really does cut comics down to what it is, to its core. And specifically, I want to focus in even further on that definition on the term deliberate sequence, because in my opinion, and in the opinion of many comic scholars, this is really where the magic happens in comics. This is what takes a group of images from just being a random selection of images and turns them into something that imparts a narrative. McCloud, this is a section from his Understanding Comics, demonstrates this really nicely here. He takes these 2 panels. In the first one, you have one man attacking another. Now you die with an axe. And in the next, you have a cityscape overlaid with a screen. And now most readers don't need to have it explained what's happening here. One man is attacking another, and in the second panel, he's struck and presumably killed. But as McCloud goes on to explain, nowhere in this comic is it actually shown. You never see the man struck by the axe, thank goodness. You never see his dead body. Instead, what happens is the comics writers or artists have put these panels in a certain order so that the reader will take information from both and read into the gutter. That's this wonderful space between the panels, and they will come to a conclusion about what has been happening. Here, of course, interpreting this as a murder that's been realized, not just threatened. We see this really nicely in this example. I love this example, even though it's unfortunately not from comics. It's from my other passion, which is video games. And even without any textual explanation here, you really understand the narrative that's being told through these images. I don't, again, think it needs to be really explained that this is an anthrocentric history of the universe, right from the Big Bang on the left through to modern day space travel on the right. And of course, it's by virtue of these images being placed in this particular sequence that allows the viewer or the reader to look at these and understand what it is. That is, again, a history of the universe from a human's perspective. And so this is really, again, what's important in comics. What's really at the core of how it tells stories, how it creates these aesthetic responses, as MacLeod says. It's by particularly sequencing images in a way and allowing, I would say perhaps even inviting the reader to connect them, to read into that gutter and to find internal connections between them. So what about Latin elegy? It may seem like a bit of a left field thing to connect this really modern medium, this really modern visual medium with this ancient textual form of poetry. And now for those who don't know anything about Latin elegy, it's a really, in my opinion, fascinating genre of poetry. It's very erotic. It tends to be about romantic relationships, almost exclusively written by elite Roman men. And it's really written from only this very brief period of time, from the fall of the Republic and into the early Principate. There's only a handful of authors who survive, unfortunately, but what we have is very heavily troped medium. And again, it tends to have this really heavy erotic focus. However, for a long time, really from the 80s, when people stopped seeing these as autobiographical, because in this poetry that the poet is ostensibly the main character. They use the I pronoun when they're telling when they're writing these poems. Right from the 80s through to even the late noughts, I would say, scholars sort of said that there's no narrative here. This is a great collection of poetry, beautiful, wonderful, wonderful literature, but there's no poetry. Pardon me, there's no narrative. And I really like this quote from Vane. He's writing about Tibullus, who is an elegist. And he says that Roman erotic elegy resembles a montage of quotations and cries from the heart. So there's no overarching narrative here in Vane and others' minds. Instead, this is variations on a theme, a bunch of poetry written about the same girlfriend, the same boyfriend, the same theme, which is romantic or sexual love. Really, of course, amour is what we should be calling it. But there's no narrative. More recently, fortunately, a lot of elegiac narratologists have begun to relook at this, and they've started saying, yes, okay, there is at least narrativity here, so the makeups of narrative, or quasi-narrative, really, but it's a fragmented narrative. It's a narrative told from fragments. People have compared it to a striptease, to cuts in a film, and this is a quote that I particularly like. I think you'll see why. This is from Salzman Mitchell, who wrote that the Amores and Latin love elegy more generally narrate stories through a succession of snapshots without explicit links, and it is the task of the reader to connect the pictures and imagine the events that operate as transitions. And of course, I've included the snapshot analogy that I gave before. And I don't know about you, but when I read this for the first time, well, actually, it was the opposite. When I read comics theory for the first time, I thought, wow, this is analogous. This is exactly what comics does. This is exactly what elegy is doing. It's taking individual fragments, individual snapshots, putting them in an intentional sequence, and inviting the reader to find the internal elements that connect them. Unfortunately, or well, fortunately for me, I guess, even though there have been a number of scholars who have made come to this conclusion about the fragmentary nature of elegiac narrativity, there hasn't yet been a concrete methodology, I should say, suggested to actually find narrative, to find narrativity in Latin elegy. Yes, most elegiac narratologists agree on this fragmented structure, but then how do we take the next step? And of course, what I suggest is that by applying a comics-based methodology, by finding meaning in sequence, by looking at poems in a sequence and finding internal elements which connect them, and reading into the gutter between these poems, we are able to then bring out certain narrative and narrativity that has previously really been invisible. And because I have a limited time, I'm not going to go into extreme detail, although I'd love to. But we do when we do read elegy with this comics-based methodology, we do find internal elements that develop over a series of poems. In the first 7 poems of Ovid's Amores, That's what I'm going to focus on here. We specifically find these two parallel streams that are developing, which is the theme of a divine relationship alongside a brewing violence, a brewing desire for violence on the part of the poet, or the ego, as I call him. In terms of the divine relationship, it's actually really interesting in my opinion, because way back in the 1970s, a scholar named Nicole had seen the arrival of Corinna, this is Ovid's girlfriend, in 1:5 as being distinctly divine. He compares it to the divine apparitions in Virgil's Aeneid. And additionally, right from the beginning of Amores 1:1, we don't have the ego or the poet addressing a girlfriend, a puella, or a boyfriend, as you would expect, but instead he addresses Cupid. There's no puella or puer even present at all until poem 1:3. And so right from the start of the poem, right from the start of the book, you have this as a divine relationship. And even when the puella is introduced in 1:3, her identity is consistently blurred with the divine. I really like 1:3 because it has, it's ostensibly a prayer to Venus, but midway through, the poet switches his addressee to the puella. But where that actually takes place, it's really hard, if not impossible, to identify where that happens. And so right from the start, right through 1:3, 1:4, and of course 1:5, which has already been identified, you have the puella with this divine association. She is semi-divine herself in many ways. Violence, which of course is probably no surprise to anybody who reads elegy, it is a violent genre, is also there right from the opening words of 1:1. For those who don't know, again, the opening of Amores 1:1 is fairly well known. Ovid writes that he had intended to write epic, but Cupid came along and lobbed off one foot of poetry, essentially forcing him from writing epic verse into writing elegiac verse. But he opens his poem with Arma violentaque bella, of course referring to Virgil's Aeneid as well. But right from the opening line, this is what the poet wants, is violence. He wants to write about warfare. When Cupid is introduced and his relationship is established with the poet in 1:2, it is one of conquest. Cupid leads the poet in a triumph through Rome. And then starting in 1:4, we start to see this simmering violence again return, starting with frankly, an offhand rape fantasy in 1:4 about the puella, even as the poet is maintaining his subservience to her and to Cupid, because of course they are really analogized. In 1:5, the sexual encounter is violent and the consent is rather dubious at best, even though the poet says that this is just play acting. In 1:6, he threatens the puella with violence. He again compares it to the siege imagery. He's besieging her home. And then both of these themes really come to this interesting head in 1:7, where violence against the puella is realized. Ovid has struck Corinna and he's now regretting it. The entire poem is about his regret for this action. But the entire incident is couched again in this religious imagery. It's referred to as sacrilegos, as sacrilegious. He compares it to the striking of Venus. He talks about it in terms of violence against the gods. And so you really see both of these streams coming to this head in this one act of violence. And of course, the subsequent regret. So having pulled out these themes, I think what a lot of people might wonder is, so what? What's the big deal? And I'm sorry, I just love this image of Superman, so I had to include it. But what we start to find here by reading into these gutters, by applying this comics reading, is causality, cause and effect, which is really the essence of narrative. We are starting to ask, and we're starting to be able to answer the question, why? Why do certain events take place? Why does Corinna appear as a divine apparition in 1:5, which again has been established for decades? Well, because her identity has been blurred with the divine right from the start. This is a poem. This is a book of poems about a relationship between the poet and the divine. Why does the ego strike his puella in 1:7? Well, again, if you go back, it's been established that the ego wants violence. He wants to write about violence. It's a violent relationship that he has with Cupid. It's one of conquest. And you have this simmering desire for violence against the puella, again, heading back right to 1:4, when he has this first rape fantasy. And so what I think is really interesting and really promising about this application is, even though these two, well, this medium and this genre are so disparate through time, through form, through everything that most people might think, when you actually look at them, they are constructing narrative in a very similar way. They're both taking fragments, putting them in a deliberate sequence that then invite the reader to find these internal connections, and thus to develop narrative, or narrativity, as the case may be. So thank you.
So Natalie, thank you so much. This is, it's so fascinating, and it's fascinating, from both perspectives. I'm learning more about elegy, and I'm learning about comics, and then to see them, to see the way that you're sort of weaving these things together and thinking about, how the structure of one helps us think about the other. So it's completely fascinating. I have to ask, as an art historian, I am really, I have encountered a sort of comic narratology from the art historical perspective and looking at images, right? And comics themselves, as you discussed, are inherently visual. So how do you think about this aspect of comics in relationship to the elegies?
It's a really interesting question. It's a huge question also. And I think in some ways what is interesting in my mind about recognizing the similarity in terms of fragmentation is that it does divorce the narrative of comics from the visual. It talks strictly about the form. Mm-hmm. But in terms of visuality, certainly, I mean, you're an art historian, you must know way more about this than I do, but Ovid, of course, in particular, has been identified as this highly visual poet. How many paintings were inspired by the Metamorphoses, for example? And elegy as well has been identified as this really, really visual genre that has had some interesting connections with visual art production. If you look at, again, Ovid's Metamorphoses, he of course analogizes the creation of elegy through his Pygmalion story, which is the creation of statuary of Averna, who becomes this woman. And of course, then later on with Arachne, it's a lot of scholars have seen in these two particular stories, as told by Ovid, as reflecting the creative process of elegy, because you're creating this woman, essentially this Puella, in elegy, and bringing her to life through your poetry, through your writing. And so there has been this long-standing connection, specifically with Ovid and the visual arts, but I would say with elegy in general and the visual arts. And of course, I mean, many ancient writers had connected the creation of poetry and the creation of art as being these very similar processes. What you get when you look at comics as well is you have a lot of early comic scholars talking about comics being written in a language. They talk again about the creation of comics in terms of literature, in terms of the textual. More recently, I think a really interesting scholar who, again, I think everybody should follow, Neil Cohn, has done some really fascinating work in his two books, The Visual Language of Comics and Who Understands Comics? And he's written about the way that comics aren't a language themselves, but the way they employ both a textual language and a visual, culturally constructed language. And he's done a lot of work comparing global visual languages, specifically in terms of manga in Japan, but he has looked globally, and it's really interesting work that he's doing. The cultural focus of his study is, again, really similar to the highly troped nature of elegy. The way, I mean, many scholars have identified many tropes that run through it. You have militia amoris, the militarization of love. You have servitium amoris, the servitude of love. You have a lot of tropes. Even the Puella is a trope character. Conte, who was writing again a while ago, identified a lot of these tropes in elegy as being these really important signifiers. Again, tying back to Saussure and semiotics, which, again, if you look at it, they actually overlay, or they actually reflect the signifiers and signifieds in comics as well, in that they're culturally constructed, in that they're very specific to the genre. Oh, I thought I had written down an interesting quote, but I haven't. And for example, like Arma, which I talked a little bit about as being the opening word of 1-1, this has such important meaning for the Romans, for Latin philologists, even outside of its simple definition, of its simple translation. It brings to mind the opening of Virgil's Aeneid, for example, which people think Ovid is reflecting here. And more than that, anytime the word arma or miles, any sort of military terms turn up in Latin elegy, people immediately think, oh, are they doing something with militia amoris here? Or are you being literal? Mm-hmm. And so again, you kind of get this really interesting overlay, again, between them, where, for example, if you look at manga, one point that's often confusing to people who don't read manga is the signifier for being turned on, for being sexually aroused, is for a character to get a nosebleed. And a lot of people in the West don't recognize this as a signifier. You can also take it to signifiers for sleep. If you have, again, in manga, it's usually people with their eyes closed and a bubble's coming out of their nose, which seems really strange to us. But then if you turn it around, our visual signifier, which is usually a Z in a speech bubble, for somebody who's never encountered a Western comic, they go, what is going on here? And so again, you have these very similar, even though one is visual and one is textual, you have these very important languages that are used, that are being employed in these comics, that are culturally constructed in many cases, and that must be learned in order to really understand the text that we're reading.
So, I mean, it's so great, and that the sleeping, that sign for sleeping, of course, is something that I recognize immediately, but of course it's not remotely logical, right, as to why that would signify sleeping. So it's so interesting, and it raises the question for me about, which I admit that I am not even really sure that I knew or ever even thought to ask how elegy would have been experienced, right? But who would have read this and in what context? Does this thinking about causality and the presence of a kind of narrativity here, does this change expectations or point towards certain ways of experiencing these poems in the ancient context?
Well, it's a really interesting question. And one thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about, but unfortunately got edited out for time, was one thing that I think we need to bring back into our discussion of all ancient texts, including elegy, is the fact that the way we are encountering these texts is fundamentally very different from the way they would have in the ancient world. Of course, we're encountering them in codices, in books, which more often than not mean that you are coming upon a poem in isolation, especially if you're reading a Loeb translation, where you will just have one poem on the page. Whereas for the ancient readers of these things, they're encountering them on the papyrus scroll, which rolls out horizontally. And it means that, much like on a comics page, where you're always surrounded by the past and the future of the narrative, because it is on the sequential strip, ancient readers would have been encountering this poetry in a very similar way, where they would always have past poems and the future poems sort of in their peripheral vision. They'd be aware of their presence, and they'd be aware of the gutters that separate them from one another. And I think they would have been able to look back a little bit more easily. I mean, there's certain, in my opinion, very interesting connections that, again, you find when you look for these internal elements. One of which is between Amores 1:6 and 1:7. In the first couplet of both poems, the poet refers to chains. In the first one, he's talking about chains on a door, but he's addressing a slave. So of course there is some subtlety there to the reference. And in 1:7, it's immediately after he struck his girlfriend, and he's talking about how he wants someone to clap his wrists in irons, basically, as punishment for this action. And for us, I mean, for me, looking at these poems and trying to find internal similarities, I do that because it's a directed effort. But for people in the ancient world, you wouldn't have to flip back and forth. You would just look to the left and you would see these similarities. And I think that I really want to bring back this focus on the textual experience, the way we encounter texts, and how it does impact how we read. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It does, yeah. And I mean, I know from our previous conversations that one of the places, or one of the things that one of the ways in which this happens is through Ovid's use of hair, right? Which I'm interested in that for other reasons. But could you talk a little bit about the way that hair works?
Oh my goodness, yes. This is another really big question. You have great questions, but they're very, very broad. This actually ties into another element of comic scholarship. It was suggested just about 15 years ago now by a French scholar named Thierry Groenstein, who again has done some wonderful work on comics. And he refers to the repetition in comics of certain imagery, even certain sequences of events. And a really, well, frankly, an oft-cited example of this is in Moore and Gibbons' Watchmen, where you have the repeated image of the smiley face, which is, of course, it's on the victim of the murder that opens the whole comic, and then is also on the cover. But its appearance throughout the comic, it's not necessarily found in sequence. It's found often in key moments of the text, and it reveals what Groenstein calls tressage or braiding, this idea of an individual image being placed not sequentially, but being braided through a comic, appearing in various places and attaining meaning because of that placement. And hair, as you really rightly identified, is a really key example of that in Ovid's Amores in particular, where right from it doesn't appear in every poem, I'll say that. It does appear a lot. It actually appears even more than Corinna is named, which I think is fascinating. So it's really this key signifier. And Corinna's hair in particular becomes really important because in the very first poem, Ovid's, of course, just been forced to write elegy instead of epic. And he says, oh, this is ridiculous. I don't even have a boy or a long-haired girl. And so right from the start, she's not identified by name. She doesn't even have an identity. She's almost this absent presence who is only identifiable by her hair. And as you move through the poems, Corinna's hair appears again and again, often in these key moments, like on her first named appearance in 1-5. And it comes to almost represent the material of her own elegiac art, which of course is seduction and keeping the man waiting and all of this. And really interestingly, in my opinion, by the end of book 1, Corinna is balded. In 1:14, which is the penultimate poem of the book, she tries to dye her hair and accidentally all of her hair falls out, basically. And it's quite a mean-spirited poem where Ovid's kind of, oh, I kept telling you to leave your hair alone. It was so beautiful. And now look at you. You're going to have to wear, wigs made from these captured German women and all of this. And he's really quite condescending about it. But what you end up getting because of this braiding is not an overt narrative per se, but it supplements the narrative in this really interesting way where Ovid opens the book bemoaning his lack of girlfriend, his lack of long-haired girl. And by the end, even though he has a abuela, she's no longer long-haired. And so he sort of starts and ends in a similar way. And it gains this ring composition, which highlights the central narratives that I'm drawing out by reading Into the Gutter.
Absolutely. So as a sort of, another big question, and we'll maybe wrap up on this, although I have one small question after that. But so what then for you are the stakes of this?
Yes, that is a really big question. Well, I think I may have, I think I hinted at it a little bit in the presentation part of this, in that I think it is the logical next step of a lot of the elegiac narratology that's been going on. People, like I said, for over a decade have been saying these are fragmented narratives. And I think it does take that next step by saying, okay, so what are the narratives? What is the narrativity in these poems? How do we read them? I think it does offer this theoretical framework. But more than that, I think that, well, I would say twofold. Outside of comic studies, I don't know if there's a lot of respect for comics as a discipline. It is, frankly, a fascinating art. I will be perfectly honest, I wasn't actually a comics reader before I started this project. And coming to it, I mean, it's just this fantastic medium, and it tells stories in such a wonderful way that I hope that this will make classicists or scholars relook at their prejudices. I mean, I know I gave a talk very similar to this actually at a university here in Canada last year, just before everything shut down. And when it was announced that I was talking about classics and comics, a couple members of the audience actually laughed. And like, you don't want that reaction. I mean, it is a serious form. And for all that, yeah, it's often about superheroes, and yeah, there are comics for kids. It's a fascinating and really unique narratological form that can inform us, I think, very, very well about other ancient genres that aren't classifiable as long form genres that we tend to privilege. I also hope that it makes people realize that classics isn't as stuffy as everybody thinks it is.
So, I mean, to that too, what can you just fill us in on some of the things that happen at the hashtag Classics Twitter comics?
Oh yes, of course. This is actually this was inspired because I was at a conference last year and people kept complaining about Zack Snyder's 300, which, I mean, yeah, but it just kept occurring to me that, like, yes, but a lot of these frankly quite offensive themes that he is drawing on are in that comic, are in the comic, and people always go to the film, which should be rightly looked at and studied and, in my opinion, criticized. But it represents such an interesting level of reception, this one comic artifact. And I kind of wanted to get people talking about comics and reading comics that engage with the ancient world. So basically what we do is every month I suggest a comic for people to read from all across the board, from all around the world, that engages with the ancient Mediterranean world in some way. And then every Friday I post a discussion question, and if people have read it and want to engage, they can. And it's created some really interesting discussions. Right now we're focusing on, because it's the summer, I did a Hades Persephone fandom summer. And so I'm having, through July and August, I'm having people read 3 different webcomics of the romance of Hades and Persephone, including, of course, Lore Olympus, which is fairly well known at this point. And then our discussion questions are about them. And July was about them sort of in isolation, and then in August we're going to be comparing them, which is going to be quite fun, I think. And there's never any pressure to participate if people don't want to, and you can always go back to questions. I don't know. It was just really a way to get people reading more and thinking more about engaging with comics, because there is this really long-standing presence of the ancient world in comics that people don't often consider. But thank you for asking about it. I'm really excited about it, because I think I'm probably more excited about it than any of the participants, but I have so much fun doing it.
Yeah, the motivation to keep it going. So that's
exactly.
And thank you for this great presentation. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you. And of course to New York University for putting this on. It's quite a pleasure to get to talk about my work.
Well, it's been a pleasure to hear you. So thank you very much.